My name is Christine Lai, and I'm the founder of Special Education Legal Fund. Let me start with a truth that surprises many families. Special education does not begin with a diagnosis. It begins with a process. And whether that process opens doors or quietly closes them depends on whether families understand how it works. Eligibility under the IDEA is a civil rights determination. It's not discretionary or subjective, and it's not something that's granted by a district when they're ready. Simply put, eligibility exists to ensure that children with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. Because IDEA starts with an obligation, not a diagnosis. IDEA does not begin with labels. It begins with Child Find. Child Find is an affirmative, ongoing legal duty that requires school districts to identify, locate, and evaluate students who may have disabilities, regardless of whether that child has a medical diagnosis, is passing classes, or is receiving informal support. Child Find exists before eligibility and before failure. Which brings us to intervention. Before a child is evaluated, schools often provide intervention services like extra academic help, behavioral supports, counseling, maybe even a behavior plan. IDEA allows schools to provide that intervention support, either academic or behavioral. And this, sounds reasonable. Support first. But here's the critical legal point that parents need to know. Interventions can never be used to delay or deny an evaluation. Intervention is not a legal detour. If a child is suspected of having a disability, the district must move forward with referral and evaluation, whether or not interventions are ongoing. RTI, or response to intervention, is not a gatekeeping tool or a waiting room, and it is not a substitute for evaluation. Using intervention as a reason to postpone eligibility violates both IDEA and Child Find obligations. If a child struggles academically, socially, behaviorally, the law does not allow schools to say, let's try just one more thing, because lost time in childhood education is time that can never be recovered. Step one of the process is the referral. A referral can come from a school, but it can also, and often should, come from a parent. And here's the most important advice in this entire talk. Put the referral request in writing. I am requesting referral for special education evaluation because I am concerned about my child's educational progress. In writing. One email starts the clock. One sentence activates legal timelines. Once the referral is received, procedural safeguards kick in. What does the school have to do now? The district must convene the appropriate planning team, adhere to the statutory guidelines, which is the timelines in which things have to take place, and they have to document the actions that they're taking. This is why written referrals matter. A written referral does not request permission. It invokes federal law. That's it. Once the school receives that request, the process is no longer optional. It is required. So you've made the request. What's the next step? The next step in the process is the consent to evaluate. But why do I have to consent if I've already requested the referral for special education? Isn't my consent implied? Parental consent is a due process protection that protects families first and foremost. IDEA requires this informed parental consent before the evaluation. This is because consent means that your rights have been explained to you. This consent means that you understand what will be tested and why. And yes, parents can withdraw consent if something doesn't feel right about the process, because the consent must be voluntary, informed, and revocable. You have to understand what assessments are being proposed and why. And importantly, If you refuse to consent, that does not absolve the district of its child find obligations. The district must still consider other lawful options in order to ensure compliance with child find. The next step after the consent is the evaluation. An evaluation is about the whole child. It's not a single test score or a single evaluative measure. It is a collection of data that is designed to answer 3 questions. Does the child have a disability? Is there an adverse impact on educational performance, whether it be academic or non-academic? And finally, does the child need special education or related services to make progress? But what exactly does educational performance mean? It doesn't just mean grades. It means behavior, social interaction, emotional regulation, and access to learning. IDEA requires evaluation in all the areas of suspected disability. Not optional, not selective, and not limited to academics. So now we're at the evaluation. What is it exactly looking at? An evaluation for special education must assess academic performance, social-emotional functioning, behavior, communication, and functional and developmental needs. Eligibility determinations based on incomplete or narrow evaluations are legally vulnerable and can frequently be overturned. But in this process, it's important to remember that you still have rights. Parents retain the right to submit their own private evaluation. Or, if the evaluation done by the school doesn't sound like your child, doesn't feel right, wasn't done with complete participation on your part, request an independent educational evaluation, or an IEE, at public expense when those school evaluations are inadequate. This is an evaluation conducted by an independent provider, mutually agreed upon by the district and the family, and paid for by the school district. IEEs are to ensure that parents retain a voice in the special education process. So now what? What comes after the evaluation? After the evaluation comes the eligibility determination. In this process, the team determines if a child is eligible for special education using data from the evaluation, information from teachers, and input from parents. Eligibility is given if, and only if, the child meets all 3 criteria in the 3-prong test. To be eligible, a child must have, number 1, a recognized disability under one of IDEA's designated categories of classification. Number 2, that recognized disability must have an adverse impact on the child's educational performance. And number 3, that adverse impact requires special education or related services. And you always have to remember that adverse impact is not limited to grades or standardized test scores. IDEA recognizes non-academic impact, including the behavior, social skills, regulation, and access to instruction. Eligibility decisions that ignore non-academic impact are inconsistent with federal law. Not a diagnosis alone, not struggle alone, but the intersection of disability and educational impact and need is how eligibility is determined. It's not about labels, it's about whether a child can access education without specialized support. So how are these decisions made? Eligibility decisions are made by a team, an interdisciplinary team that includes parents. Parents are not observers in this process. They are required members of the team, the most important members of the eligibility team, and their input is necessary to determining eligibility. So you've gone through this whole process, and what happens if eligibility is denied? What happens is prior written notice happens. The district must explain and must provide prior written notice explaining the decision that was made, why it was made, the data that was relied upon, and what alternatives were considered and rejected. Failure to provide prior written notice on an eligibility denial is a procedural violation. Please see our video on prior written notice, the most important document you've never heard of, for more information about this very important right of parents. So after eligibility is determined, the next step is placement. But what does that mean and how is it decided? First of all, placement is not a place, despite the name. It's a promise. It's often misunderstood, but it doesn't mean a building or where the child goes. What placement is how the team determines how services that the child needs will be delivered. The determination of placement must match the IEP. It's not a question of convenience or budgets or staffing shortages. What the child needs is what determines placement. What is appropriate for the child determines placement. And the placement has to be timely and based on the child's functional needs. Placement decisions, first and foremost, have to be individualized and based on the child's needs, not the programs available, and most importantly, comply with least restrictive environment requirements. So we've gotten to the placement part of the special education process. The next step is parental consent. But why do I have to consent again? Haven't I already consented to the evaluation and to the determination? That's true, but initial placement requires parent consent, informed parental consent. Your services, the services for your child, can't start without it. But it's important to remember that you can still agree to services and disagree with how those services are delivered. You can accept services and still dispute the placement, the methodology, or even the adequacy of those services. Eligibility is where IDEA moves from principle to practice. It is the point at which rights become enforceable, services become mandatory, and when eligibility is delayed, minimized, or denied improperly, FAPE is denied. Your free, appropriate public education is denied. So this becomes critical. Families have to understand the law, because once families understand the law, eligibility stops being a barrier and becomes what Congress intended, the gateway to educational access, dignity, and equity. Thank you.